Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Psalms.
Talking about the book of Psalms in a format like this is going to expose me, because pretty much everything we've done up till this point, I felt like, all right, if I didn't catch the matrix, the pattern to what's going on in this book on the first read through, I think I can get it on the second. A couple of them took me a third. Psalms, I'm just going to level with you. I had to call in help. I've read this book several times over the course of my life, and I've been moved by this ancient collection of poems and songs, but there's just so much here that, other than the obvious structure, which is it's divided up into what's labeled as 5 books. Other than that, it's really hard for me to see the pattern on this and the matrix on this one. So this time around, I straight up went out and consulted some resources to be like, just typically, how do people divide this book up and what do they see going on structurally? And let me tell you, it was incredibly, one, humbling because I didn't immediately see it myself, and 2, helpful, because what I'm discovering now that it's been pointed out to me is there's some pretty amazing thought that went into not just how the Psalms were written, but how they were assembled and built out and ordered and organized by whoever did this work. Well, right off the bat, Psalms stands out as being a pretty cool book because you got so many authors kicking in on it, and we actually know the names of several of them. You know, obviously, David is a famous psalmist. He wrote probably almost half of these. And then Moses and Solomon show up. Some other named authors also contribute, even multiple psalms. And then there's a bunch of these that are just anonymous. I think it's kind of fun to sit around and imagine which characters we've encountered through the story of the Old Testament who maybe wrote some of these really beautiful, heartfelt psalms and kind of bare their souls to us, but we just don't get to know who it is. So I think the multitude of contributors makes Psalms pretty unique and pretty cool, but also the very important role that the editor, the assembler of this book plays, makes Psalms very interesting. And I think that's a very unique facet of this. Somebody, and smart people believe that it was somebody during that Persian exile period we've been talking about, like with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, somebody during that time was like, hey, we got all of this rich tradition of music and poetry and prose and verse from across the centuries of the story of our journey as the chosen people of God. Somebody needs to organize that stuff up in a way where it's all accessible and bound up into one thing, but also somebody needs to organize that stuff up in a way that orders it such that it tells a story, that it communicates, it emphasizes the big theological points. It looks like somebody thought to themselves, we should put as much theological care and crafting thought into how we select and organize these psalms as was put into writing them in the first place. And so again, this structure is something that was not immediately evident to me, and I had to go and dig around. But what I found is that there's pretty much universal agreement amongst smart people who do this for a living that this is how it works. Chapters 1 and 2 sometimes get lumped into book 1 out of 5. I mean, 5 big books. That's how Psalms overtly is structured. But Psalms 1 and 2 probably sit outside the boundaries of book 1 and serve as a thematic introduction to 2 big ideas. One is the idea of reflection, that the law of the Lord and all of the stories that you and I have looked at up till this point going through the Bible is something that's like a lifetime commitment. You reflect on that intellectually, but you also reflect on that at the level of the heart. And in a way, this is communion with God. That's emphasized in Psalm 1. Psalm 2 takes us right back to that promise that was made in Chronicles and Samuel to David, where you'll recall David was like, oh, God, this is great. I want to build you a house, a temple. And God says, I'm going to have your descendants do that. But instead, I'm going to build you a house. It's going to be a royal house. And there's going to be this great eternal king who will sit on this great eternal throne. Well, Psalm 2 emphasizes that, this idea of expectantly looking forward to the deliverance that is going to come through that promised Messiah who is descended from David. And now that I've had somebody point it out to me, I totally see this repetition and this pattern through the 5 books of Psalms. But each of these books, in its own way, really deals with these 2 themes. Reflection on God. Sometimes that's poetically demonstrated in awe of God and praise of God. Sometimes it's demonstrated in reflection on the behavior of God, or even wondering about how God will deal with things that are very problematic and hurtful in the world. So there's that reflection on the law, on the story of God and his chosen people in each of these books. But then there's also some element of looking forward to that promised Messiah in each of these books. And then when you look closer at each of these books, you find that there's symmetry within each of these 5 books as well. So book 1 is Psalm 3 to Psalm 41. There's a whole lot of David in here, and there's a whole lot of songs of hurt and heartache, songs of lament, psalms where the psalmist expresses their desperation before God. My enemies are doing this to me. Give me deliverance. And in the early going here, like book 1, you get a few songs of celebration of God kind of sprinkled in there as well, but it's pretty heavily weighted toward those songs of personal reflection and lament, even anger and aggravation toward the psalmist's enemies. But in all of, for example, book 1, you get this heavy emphasis on David as this precursor, as this type of the Messiah who is to come later. In book 2, you get a little bit more of the stuff about praise and celebration of God and a little bit less of the lament business. But again, the emphasis is heavily on this messianic king who is to come, and how that messianic king isn't just the fulfillment of a promise to David, but it's the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham and the promise of a redemptive plan in general, going all the way back to the beginning. And then book 3, which is pretty short, focuses more on the kingdom that is promised and all of the hope that lies with that, in contrast to the circumstances in which this stuff is being assembled, that being exile and not having a true kingdom or any kind of independence. Sounds like a very modern term, but I think you know what I mean. By the time we get to book 4, which is Psalms 90 through 106, again, pretty short, we've seen that lament and hurt and heartache theme really taper off. And now we're getting more heavily into that optimism theme about God's glory and God's reign and God's people being rallied together to see that and to celebrate that. And it highlights how all of that hope is possible because the promise to David is unconditional. God is going to redeem. The Messiah thing is going to happen one way or another. And then book 5 is gargantuan and has a whole lot of internal structure, with the massive Psalm 119 being the centerpiece of all of it. And this section of the Psalms is the section that gets quoted a ton in the New Testament, in particular Psalm 110, something Jesus alludes to, I think, more than any other psalm. And the reason for that is because now we're in full-throated praise mode. God and his glory, God is king, God is conqueror, God is the one who does not forget his people, God is the one who redeems. It's like this is an anticipatory celebration of all of the payoffs of everything that has been promised throughout that Old Testament story that we've been looking at. And then the last 5 chapters are like the grand finale of a fireworks show, where each massive, beautiful, bright, colorful explosion proclaims the glory of God and his praises in one more dramatic fashion until we conclude in Psalm 150. Straight up, I think the book of Psalms is really effective just being read in isolation, but it's way more effective against the backdrop of the Old Testament story. And in the same way that in the book of Psalms, there's a whole lot of the problem being emphasized at the beginning and a little glimmer of the praise being emphasized early on, but gradually we see the problem emphasis tapering down as we move forward in Psalms, and the praise and celebration of who God is and the hope side of things moving up in volume as we move through the Psalms. So that's kind of the pattern in the Old Testament in general that we're seeing here. The further we get into this story, the more it looks like, no, this was a tough road, but God is going to make good on his promises and he's going to deliver. When you visualize the book of Psalms, imagine David is king in good times with God, playing the harp and singing songs of praise to God. But also imagine David on the run out in the wilds, scratching out lyrics to this poem in the dirt while he's in a state of deep despair and tremendous duress. Under both circumstances, he's calling out to God and baring his heart. When you think about the theme of Psalms, think about heartfelt celebration of the glorious attributes of the great God of everything, the maker of all things, the one who doesn't forget his promises, and the one who will redeem. If you don't have time to read all of Psalms and you're already relatively familiar with Psalm 23, read Psalms 1, Psalm 2, and Psalm 110. And with that, my friends, we have leveled up, and I really feel like I leveled up on this one. I'm seeing the matrix on Psalms better than I ever have, so thank you for forcing me to do this simply by merit of your being here and being interested. That is a favor to me, and I'm very grateful. All right, Proverbs next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.